Have you ever experienced or witnessed a racial microaggression? Have you ever wondered what can schools do to confront racial microaggressions and to make schools and districts more racially just and more anti-racist? If you've ever wondered or answered yes about any of these questions, then you are in the right place. Hi, I'm Dr. Terrance L. I'm a tenured professor, and I've helped to prepare hundreds of racially just and anti-racist school leaders, and I want to help you. That's why I created this podcast to provide you and your team with real-world insights and practices that work so that you can collectively build racially just schools. On today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about what racial microaggressions are, the impacts that they have on youth and on schools, but more than anything, what is it that you can practically do to address and to confront racial microaggressions in your school, classroom, or district. Before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that this podcast is brought to you by www.raciallyjustschools.com. And when you join our community today, I will send you a free video on how to make your racial justice work better. I'm excited about you joining the community, and I look forward to meeting you. And if you're ready to get into today's episode, we will in 1 second. But first, I have a special announcer that's going to get us started.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast with your host, Dr. Terrance L. He's my daddy, and he's the best ever.
Let's go.
You're listening to the Racially Just Schools podcast, the show that provides resources to help you and your team build racially just schools. Now, here's your host, Dr. Terrance L.
Welcome to the Racially Just Schools podcast. My name is Terrance L. and I am your host. Hey, as always, I am delighted, I am exhilarated, I am joyful, I am grateful that you are here today for this episode. Now, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about racial microaggressions. This is super important because these are the subtle, small ways that can accumulate in some very large and systemic and powerful ways that racism takes place in school districts, in classrooms, in hallways, on the playground, across districts, in some powerful and profound ways, but sometimes they're often overlooked or they're not perceived or they're not picking up. They're perceived and picked up by the folks who actually receive them. So we're going to be talking about what are racial microaggressions, what types of impacts do they have on students, on youth, on schools, on culture, and the final part I'm going to talk to you about, like, what are some things that you can actually start to do to address and to confront racial microaggressions? What can you do in your classroom? What can you do in your district? What can you do across your school? What are some things that you can practically start to do to confront, to anticipate, and to stop racial microaggressions that happen and occur in school? So I am super excited about this episode. So let's hop right in. To start, I want to talk a little bit about what are racial microaggressions. And to do that, I want to provide a little historical context about, what are racial microaggressions in terms of like how they came about, where did this work come from? And so based on historically from what I've been able to understand in my research and my work is that the term racial microaggressions was actually coined by a Harvard psychiatrist, a brother by the name of Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s. And essentially what Dr. Pierce was doing as he was thinking about racial microaggressions, he framed them as the subtle, the stunning, these kind of like often automatic and nonverbal exchanges which are intended to, in this terms, put down black people by the offenders, the people who actually committed them. Since the 70s, the term has been expanded. It has grown significantly. When I was in graduate school, I remember I had a course with Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, and one of the readings we had was about critical race theory, but we were reading about critical race theory first from legal scholars, right? To really understand what critical race theory is in education, you must go back to the grounding, the roots, the foundation in the legal field. And I remember reading an article by Patricia Williams, who is a legal scholar, and she talked about racial microaggressions as a form of racism, right? we often think about racism as being like structural, as being systemic, as being interpersonal, as being, and it's all these things, but racism also shows up in the forms of microaggressions. And so her argument was that the showing up of racial microaggressions was actually kind of like the manifestation of these larger systems of racism in people's everyday interactions, right? And so the racial microaggressions can be extremely insidious because they are so subtle, and sometimes people don't detect them, and it can be so difficult to identify. But I remember in that article, she making this argument about the cumulative impact of these racial microaggressions. And I remember Dr. Blasson Billings, and folks would always say this, is like racial microaggressions like death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's like over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I remember what Williams was arguing is like the cumulative impact of these can be so significant that they can contribute to this significant and this profound alienation and marginalization on the part of the people who actually experience the racial microaggressions, particularly black folks. And so when I think about critical race theory, I am often reminded of the work of Richard Delgado and Gene Stefantic as they talk about, racial microaggressions, being like the subtle nuances and these code words that can show up in the forms of, body language, the types of averted gazes and looks, and the various terms that people use as they talk about, black people and other racially minoritized folks. So as I think about racial microaggressions and the research and the work that has come before that we're anchored and grounded in, I think about racial microaggressions being a part of these four categories. Number one is the physical and embodied. So like their physical actions and things that people can do that can convey racial microaggressions. They're also the perceptive things, right? How people look towards you and view you. The third is the language, the words that they actually speak and say. And then the fourth are like the actual things that they do. So is the physical, embodied, perspectives, language, and actions that convey the subtle and less detected forms of racism. That's how I come to understand and make meaning of what racial microaggressions are. This is just one way to enter into it and think about it. And so, yeah, those are racial microaggressions. The death by 1,000 cuts through the physical embodied, through the perceptive, through the language, through the action. These subtle, less detected forms of racism is how I come to understand and make meaning around what racial microaggressions are. Now I want to talk a little bit about some examples of racial microaggressions, and I want to do this in two ways. First, I want to talk a little bit about some general broad ways that racial microaggressions just show up in everyday life, and then I want to be a little more specific around how they can show up in schools. And again, there'll be some overlap. They're not completely divergent and distinct from one another. But as we think about like general forms of like racial microaggressions, it can be thinking about language and things that people say. It's the comments that I've had these comments mostly from white people, but it's like they'll say something like, "You're so articulate," you know what I'm saying? Or they'll be like, "You speak so well," and they'll leave it like that. Sometimes they'll say things like, when I'm talking about black people, I wasn't really talking about you, right? And so they try to create this whole narrative and this myth around talking about black people, but knowing that I'm black, but then saying, well, I wasn't talking about you. And then, or they'll say things like these subtle things. If there were only more people like you, right? If there were only more black people like you. I remember I took a couple of actual business courses when I was in graduate school over in the B school. And I remember somehow we got on, I was from Detroit, and I remember this one white woman, she made a comment like, well, maybe if everybody worked harder like you. And I was like, what? I was like, I can name 45 people in my class who were way smarter than me. It was like opportunity structures. There were some systemic racial barriers and challenges that, created situations where people who were, I thought, had much richer intellect than me, who didn't find themselves in the doctoral program at a university, right? And so I remember going back and forth with her and then the rest of the people in that class in some ways, because they tried to create this dynamic of talking about race but not wanting to talk explicitly about race, but exclude it from its larger social context in which people emerge. Or people will say stuff like, "Oh, you speak such good English. You speak without an accent, and I didn't think you were Mexican." You know what I mean? They'll say these types of comments. It's also the actions of people clutching, their purses or their pearls when you get on the elevator, or they'll walk across the street when they see you coming. Like all those dynamics, those embodied, those physical, those linguistics, the language, forms of people expressing and conveying racism. And I want to talk a little bit about this, of like some of the ways that this shows up in schools, because this is not exclusively, exclusive to things that happen like outside of schools. But here are a few ways that racial microaggressions actually show up in schools and in districts. As I think about schools, there are a couple of ways in which, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some ways that racial microaggressions can show up in schools. I think is one, it is ignoring and dismissing a student's perspective based on their race, and particularly ignoring the perspectives of Black students, of Indigenous students, of Latinx students, Asian Pacific Islander students. Just ignoring those perspectives because they're Black, like trying to tell you something academically, trying to tell you something that's happened culturally or socially, but you completely ignore it. You dismiss it because of who they are, who the messenger is, and the racialized body in which it's coming from. I think another way that racial microaggressions can show up is by using racial stereotypes to describe student groups or groups of students, right? You use particular racial tropes and narrative to describe a particular group of students. I remember hearing some folks talk about Black students as like the late students, or they would talk about they would use terms like apartment kids, and they was using that as a proxy, particularly not even to talk about social class in this particular context, but to talk about race. I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, telling a Black student or a student who is Latinx, or a student who's Mexican, saying like, "Oh, you're so articulate and well-spoken," as if it's surprising, right? I think that's a way it can show up. I think another way it can show up is expecting a Black student to be the authority on everything about race, right? So particularly if you are in racially diverse contexts, or you're in contexts where there are just a few Black people in the school or in a particular classroom, university, high school, wherever it is, middle school, and everybody turn around to the one or two Black people in the class and expect them to be like the authorities and know-all about everything that has to do with race, right? And so that's one of the ways that it can show up. I think it's assuming, and I've had this happen to me, assuming that a Black student or a racially minoritized student is from a lower socioeconomic background, or they're a first-generation college student. And there's nothing wrong with being a first-generation college student. There's nothing wrong with having various socioeconomic experiences. But I think there is something that is wrong with when you automatically associate that with a particular racialized group, right? So I remember one time I was in graduate school, and I asked a professor to write me a letter of recommendation. And one of the things they put in the letter of recommendation, they said, well, Terrance is a first-generation college student or graduate student or something like that. And I was like, that ain't right, dog. You wronged in a mug. Like, my parents met at a university. They met at a historically Black college, right? So I'm second generation, and my mama got her master's degree in social work. So holla at your boy when you do some research. You know what I'm saying? But it was like the assumption that was made. And I remember reading that letter, and I went back. I'm like, who the heck you writing about? And not that it was this thing that I had to show up, but it was just the assumption that this professor made about who I was and my family dynamics only because I was Black, right? Well, somebody said, well, you don't have the evidence to prove it. Well, I got my lived experience to prove it, right? And then I think it's also the assumptions that are made about a student's language proficiency or their fluency, again, based on that race. You think just because a student is Latinx, you have some assumptions about their language and the ways in which they speak. Particularly if they're Black too, you have these assumptions around language. So that's a way in which it can show up. And I think, again, making jokes, right? And then people using terms. Like I was in a context not too long ago, and this woman, she was joking, but she made this comment towards a Black male, and she used the term boy. And, I'm like, I know what she meant. But if she understood history and understood race and racial dynamics, I'm like, that's lightweight racist in the mug. You know what I'm saying? It was like in jest and in joking, but I called it was perceptive. Now, imagine being in a context like that and somebody saying that continually. Well, we're going to have to, have a conversation very quickly because the dynamics of that. But to me, that was a death by 1,000 cuts. And I don't even know if the person perceived it and received it that way. But my antennas was up once she said, "Boy," I was like, hey, sit down, fam." You know what I'm saying? So these are some of the ways in which racial microaggressions can show up in schools, in districts, and in classrooms. Now I want to spend a little time talking about some of the impacts of racial microaggressions, particularly on students and the people who receive them. And I think one of the things that is important is that the racial microaggressions can occur not just from individuals or groups of people, but they can be like institutionalized. Like these are common ways that we practice. These are norms in our schools. This is the way that we talk, the language and the discourse that we use. This is the culture. And so like racial microaggressions can be institutionalized. And remember, going back to some of the scholars I talked about earlier, Patricia Williams and Richard Delgado and a lot of the critical race theorists, they don't separate racial microaggressions from like larger systemic racism, right? So racial microaggressions are another emergence and manifestation of racism in particular subtle and less detected ways. But some of the impacts of racial microaggressions are psychological distress, right? That racial microaggressions can cause like anxiety. It can cause self-doubt. It can cause in many ways, it can cause depression. Like you can be in some of these spaces, they can be so psychologically draining and depleting, but that is one of the impacts of racial microaggressions. I think the other thing we know from decades of research, particularly around stereotype threat and Claude Steele's work, is that it can have an impact on students' academic experiences, and not just their experiences, their performance and things of that nature. And so it can cause folks to begin to struggle in class. Like you always looking at me every time we talk about race, like it can create these dynamics, and the content and the curriculum and the instruction that I'm reading is in many ways racist. Yeah, it can lead to this next thing. Like people can just disengage, right? They can be like, man, bump this, chucking the deuces up. And so because you feel unwelcome, you don't feel like it's a place of support. And so one can disengage. And so these racial microaggressions can also lead to like push out, students being pushed out from school. They can also lead to health impacts. Like racism has a physiological impact on people's bodies. Like it literally can impact your body. I know firsthand, like you can begin to embody this. And so it can lead to high blood pressure. It can lead to cognitive issues. It can lead to types of heart disease, health problems, all types of health challenges that one could actually trace back from being in a racist environment. And I have talked to, and I know too many people, particularly black people and black women, whose health has been negatively impacted by being in racist environments for long periods of time. Like people actually can have benefits from leaving racist environments, like health benefits, like they don't have to be on certain medications anymore. And so like this is another impact on it. But it also can create like these relational difficulties, right? It's difficult for me to connect with folks and really build, particularly for a student and a young person, to build with teachers, to build with colleagues. If you're constantly in this place where you're getting these death by 1,000 cuts and there's nothing that is being done to address it. So these are some of the impacts that racial microaggressions can have on youth, and not just the youth and young people, but also to the adults that are working within that school or district environment. Now I want to spend the remaining time here talking about a few things that schools can actually do, districts, that teachers can do in their classrooms to address racial microaggressions. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this should be something to, get you started and to continue your work and your journey in this area. So when you think about, racial microaggressions, like some of the things you can start to do. One, you can acknowledge the issue and work to restore, right? So one of the things that happens is racial microaggressions are often dismissed. They're not acknowledged. They act as if they never existed. But then the person who received or was on the receiving end of that racial microaggression is now left with that racism experience in their physical body, in their mind, in that whole experience. And so one of the things that you can do in a school or a district or a classroom is to acknowledge that it happened. This existed, and work to restore. So these two go together. It was one thing, but it's two. Like you acknowledge it and you work to restore. And the question around restoration that has always helped me and that I always like to ask, or one of them, is like, what do you need to be made whole again, right? It's not enough to just apologize or we're sorry that this happened. Now the question is like, that harmed you in some type of way. That was violent to you in a particular way. What is it that you need to be made whole again? So it is the addressing and the acknowledge that this thing happened, but it is also the restorative or restoration process of making sure that people are whole again after they've experienced this. I think another thing here, and I debated on whether or not to talk about this because I think sometimes it's overcompensated and people do it too much. But I think if it's done in a diligent way and in a proper way, that it can have some fruit. So the thing I'm going to say here, the next thing I think is to provide job embedded ongoing professional learning around racial microaggressions, right? One of the things, and you've heard me say this if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, like you can't professional develop your way out of white supremacy. You just can't. And at the same time, there is some utility and some fruitfulness and some transformation that can happen when people have job embedded professional learning, that the professional learning that they're engaged in is not just from like a sage on the stage, but is like embedded in their actual job. And there is time that is allocated for people to critically reflect on their practice, to learn and to grow. But most times, like schools and districts, they don't schedule that time. That time doesn't exist. And so like you want a million things, but it's not time to do it. And so what I'm saying, like to have the job embedded ongoing professional learning that creates the space for critical reflection on how do I handle it? What do I do? I just saw that I did that one and I missed it by a big mark. Like that's an institutional cultural thing that must be a part of the larger schedule that a school or district has. But it is creating this job embedded ongoing learning so that people continue to learn from this. And then the tool, or as my one colleague, Dr. Dakota Irby, talks about, the resource for the learning is the school, right? You ain't got to go read 45, 50 million books. There are, you can source learning examples and experiences from the school. Now, one of the limitations of this is that when people want to do job embedded professional learning, you can't, this is the tension of it, that you learn from what happened, but you don't want to get into a habit of using black students and students who are racially minoritized as only tools for learning for white people and white teachers and white leaders. You feel me? Right? Because then it becomes like, and this is why restoring that which was harmed and lost is so important. Because if you don't, then you only see black students and racially minoritized students as tools for white learning. And that in and of itself is a racial microaggression that actually could be a macroaggression, because you're using my harm as a tool for your learning, but you are not doing anything to restore the harm that is being inflicted, right? I can say more about this. I should probably do a whole episode on job embedded professional learning. In the job embedded professional learning that I'm talking about is not looking at professional learning as like a savior from white supremacy in racist school districts. So I need to unpack that a little more. But the next thing I was going to say is to create and foster an ongoing culture and climate of that is racially just and radically humanizing for students, right? And so this goes to work on the culture of the classroom. You know, what is said, how is it said? What are the routines of the classroom? What are the pictures that are on the wall? What is the language that is being used, right? All these cultural things. What are the artifacts that are exchanged, that are present in the classroom, right? So doing this ongoing, being proactive and preemptive to make sure that you're building community that is radically humanizing, that is racially just on the front end, are some things that you can do. I think one of the other things is like, this goes back with some of the early ones, is like actually addressing the racial microaggression, right? So it's one thing to acknowledge it, is another thing to work to restore, but you got to actually address it head on, right? So this may mean like you have a system for elevating it so that it can be known, is reported, having a system to make sure that you're following up and to make sure that any harm that was done is you're working to repair it. Whatever actions that have to be taken, you are doing something to address it, right? So that is super important, because if not, then you got all this stuff that's happening and then, nobody's doing anything about it. I think the next thing you can do is I will combine these two, is that you need to have ongoing feedback and constantly be looking at your work. I don't want to say evaluate or to monitor it, because I think those conjure up these notions, but I think it's having a radical form of accountability to what you're doing. And not for punitive sakes, but like you're literally collecting feedback. And this episode 28, check that out, on how to center students and youth voice in your racial justice work. I think one of the things is making sure that students, particularly Black students and students that have been racially marginalized, are central in the decision-making processes, but it's also having a mechanism by which you can collectively engage in ongoing feedback with, like, yeah, we've been working on the racial microaggressions. How are we doing? What are some areas in which we've missed it? What are some ways in which it's continuing to show up? How might we problematize and solve and think about working through some potential solutions that we can ideate and prototype around what we can do to make this culture and this environment more racially just and more radically humanizing. But you're constantly ongoing collecting feedback after every lesson, after every faculty meeting, after every parent-teacher interaction and engagement and family engagement and caregiver engagement. Like, you're collecting this ongoing feedback so you can constantly be engaged in like this radical accountability about how we are doing with this work. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I think we can do is to anticipate, right? So I think we need to anticipate and work from the position like, look, schools and districts, they are racist. They are steeped in a foundation of white supremacy. And unless we are actively working to disrupt that and to redesign something different and radically different and new and fresh, then we need to be working from the assumption that we're going into a situation where these things are happening and we must interrupt it and now redesign or recreate something that is racially just and radically humanizing. And so if you're anticipating something, you are trying to be proactive to prevent it from happening in the first place. So that's what I'm saying, the anticipation. I'm not saying like you passively wait and anticipate for it to happen and then it happens, you're like, oh, there it is. Then you go through the whole list of everything I said. No, because you know that these things, that racial microaggressions can happen and will happen and have happened, you are anticipating them so that you can stop them and undermine them before they happen, right? All right, so I hope that was helpful. Those are just a few things you can do. There are many other things that you can begin to do to start to address racial microaggressions. I hope you got something out of that, and I hope that you found something in there that was useful. But racial microaggressions are something that should be on our radar as racially just school leaders, educators, caregivers, paraprofessionals, whomever, in whatever capacity in which you work in a school. Like, this should be on our radar. So I hope this was practical. Hey, I would love to hear from you. So if you got any questions or anything, please feel free to send me an email at Terrance@raciallyjustschools.com. I hope this is useful for you and your team. Hey, so thank you so much for joining. Well, that is it, folks. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am so excited and really looking forward to our time together during future podcasts. What I need you to do is to please hit the subscribe button, share with a friend, and please leave a review. We love reviews. And if you want to hear more from me, you can head on over to www.raciallyjustschools.com. That is www.raciallyjustschools.com. When you join our community, I have a free video for you on 3 tips that will make your racial justice work better. And again, if you love the show, hit subscribe, rate it, and leave a review on iTunes. And until next time, peace.